Hello everyone, this is Chris Carlson, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Boston Tea Party protest. We'll be exploring the history of this famous protest and why it is such an important and critical time in our nation's history. And we'll also be taking a more in-depth look at not only the history behind the event itself, but the events leading up to it as well, and specifically why the colonists were so upset with the British during this time, and what kind of caused the tensions to hit an all-time high leading up to this event. So I hope you guys enjoy the presentation. So before we get to the actual event itself, it's important to understand where it all began. This all began in 1620 when the Pilgrims, who departed from Plymouth, England, departed for the New World. And their ship was the Mayflower, and it was captained by William Bradford. And William Bradford led this ship of 102 passengers and about 30 crewmen on a grueling 10-week voyage to the New World. And eventually it dropped anchor at what is now present-day Cape Cod on November 11th, 1620. Again, this is a very grueling journey. There was sickness, there was disease, and there was only one fatality on the actual trip itself. However, once they actually got to the New World and they had to contend with a very brutal winter, they ended up losing about half of their original pilgrims in the ship. So it was a very, very difficult time when they were first starting out and first trying to settle in the New World. Eventually, the colonists started to thrive and expand in the New World, and problems didn't actually arise until the French and Indian War of 1753 to 1763. When France's expansion into the Ohio River Valley brought repeated conflict with the claims of the British colonies, a series of battles led to the official British declaration of war in 1756, 3 years after the fighting had started. This is a very bloody and expensive war for the British Empire and the colonists. The French, who had allied themselves with the Native American Indians, sought to push the British out of the colonies in an attempt to take the land for their own. Now, as a result of this very bloody, very expensive war, the British were left with massive financial war debts. And in an attempt to get some of that money back, the British decided to impose new tax policies on the colonists. This was deemed appropriate by British Parliament, as the British soldiers had just saved the colonists from the French and the Indians during the war. So they thought it fitting that the colonists helped to recoup some of that debt. This started with the Stamp Act, passed in 1763, an act for granting and applying certain stamp duties and other duties in the British colonies. Now, needless to say, this next event did not ease any of the tensions already there between the British soldiers and the colonists. The Boston Massacre of 1770, a riot that began when a group of 50 citizens gathered outside of the State House to protest the large presence of British soldiers in the city. This took place outside of the old State House in Boston. It began when a large group of protesters started yelling and threatening the lone sentry that was posted there. The British Captain Preston arrived a moment later with a small group of soldiers to relieve the sentry. The mob only grew larger and more violent until eventually the group of British soldiers fired into the crowd, killing several of them. The most famous of which was Crispus Attucks, who was a former slave and revolutionary at the time. Now, before we go any further, it's important to understand, why were the colonists so upset with the British at this point? Well, there were several reasons why. First, and perhaps most importantly, they were taxed without any representation in British Parliament. So the British Parliament's say was final. They could essentially do whatever they wanted to the colonists without any sort of opposition, and the colonists had no representation, no representative within the British Parliament. So they found that it was very unfair of the British Parliament to pass any sort of taxes on them without equal representation. Among other things, they were also forced to house and feed British soldiers. and even faced strict discipline if they were refused. The British also severely limited their trade with other nations, and really only allowed them to trade with the British and the British allies. Which of course brings us to the Tea Act of 1773. Now the Tea Act was the final straw in this series of unpopular policies and taxes imposed by Britain on her American colonies. Right, so at this point, the colonists really had had enough with the British. They couldn't stand the fact that they were being taxed without equal representation in British Parliament, and, again, the Boston Massacre had only added to those tensions, and all of a sudden now, they had this new tea tax that they had to deal with, and of course this sort of caused the tensions with the British to boil over entirely. Which brings us to the actual Boston Tea Party itself, which also took place that same year in 1773, when a large group of protesters stormed 3 British ships carrying tea in the Boston harbor. And this again was brought upon by years of unfair taxation without representation, as well as other grievances by the British to the colonies. Now this protest was important because it sent a very clear message to the British that the colonies and the colonists were willing to directly act against the British, and not just sit by anymore and just take it. And this protest would go on to spark similar acts of protest around the area, including New York, and eventually help to sow the seeds of revolution within the colonies. So who exactly was involved in this famous protest? This was a group of angry colonists who may have been disguised as Tomahawk Indians. And to the left is a picture of a Tomahawk Indian, which may have resembled the disguise that the colonists had used. It was also thought at the time that Samuel Adams, the famous revolutionary, may have possibly been involved in the protest itself. This is mostly due to the fact that after the protest, he largely defended the act and promoted it in writing and in protest himself. John Adams also spoke out in favor of the protest, and even claimed later that drinking tea was no longer patriotic. Eventually, this would lead to the colonists favoring coffee as a drink over tea. So when all was said and done, in total about 92,000 pounds of tea were believed to have been destroyed that night, with financial losses to the British of around $1 million in today's standards. And in response to this, Britain almost immediately passes the Intolerable Acts, part of which put Massachusetts under direct British control, because Massachusetts at that time had the luxury of being able to sort of govern themselves, and that right was taken away from them in response and as revenge for the Boston Tea Party. And this, of course, only angered the colonists further, pushing them towards an inevitable war with the British. So again, this famous protest and the events leading up to it really helped to sow the seeds of revolution within the colonies. So the Boston Tea Party and the subsequent Intolerable Acts, as we just discussed, had inspired similar acts around the nation. In no small part due to this protest and the acts preceding it, and both in the aftermath. The colonists were able to fight and eventually win their independence from Britain. And this again was only possible, in part, by exercising their right to protest for their rights. So at the end of the day, why was the Boston Tea Party important? Well, without it, there may have been no revolution. If the colonists back then had not been willing to protest for their rights, then we may be living in a very different country today. And this country really, at the end of the day, was founded entirely on our right as citizens to protest for our equal rights. And since then, we've really seen this happen and expand all throughout our nation's history. Whether we're protesting against racial injustices and police brutality, or against certain political opponents that we disagree with. Change cannot and will not happen unless we as citizens are willing to protest for our rights. This was proven true as a result of the Boston Tea Party protest, and we as citizens continue to prove the concept true all the way through the present day. And finally, I just have my works cited. I have my 5 different sources here that I used for my presentation. So this is simply for academic purposes here that I'm going to just leave this here for you guys to look at. So in conclusion, I really hope you guys enjoyed the presentation. I hope you guys learned something from it. And I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say. So thank you guys.